Okay, so it's now about 1 minute after the hour, so I think we will get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you all for tuning in today. On behalf of Biotech Canada, we are excited to feature 3 experts from the law firm Gowling WLG for a virtual session exploring government economic assistance programs for the biotech and life sciences sector that address business hardships related to COVID-19. So I'd like to give a warm welcome to Nina Gupta, Ted Thiessen, and Colin Green. Thank you all so much for joining us today. So before we begin, to our attendees, I'd like to bring your attention to the Q&A feature. So if you hover your mouse down towards the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see a gray menu bar pop up. If you have questions during the presentation, please type them in here and we'll try to get them answered at the end of the session. That said, there is quite a lot of content today in this presentation, so there's a chance we may not get to your questions during the webinar, but we will be sure to address them via email afterwards. So with that, I will mute myself and turn off my video and hand it over to Nina. Go ahead, Nina.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nina Gupta, and I'm a partner at Gowling WLG in the Employment, Labor, and Equality section. I practice in the Waterloo region. I'm joined by 2 of my wonderful tax partners, Colin Green in Ottawa and Ted Thiessen in Calgary, who are distinguished tax practitioners. Instead of reading a boring bio, I thought you'd like to know a little bit about the human beings behind the partner, if you will. Colin is an avid hiker, and Ted Thiessen has a background as a classic scholar, which I think makes him wonderfully prepared for the practice of law, perhaps not so well prepared to be a handyman or around the house, but we can talk to his wife about that. Just a note, this is not intended to be legal advice. Every practitioner will tell you that to give proper legal advice, we need to get into the kinds of details that we couldn't possibly get into in a high-level overall overview. We encourage you to talk to your own lawyers and accountants, and also to recognize that the situation is fluid. Government programs have changed, sometimes on a daily basis. So we're doing the best we can in these circumstances, but again, consult with your own lawyer or accountant before making any decisions. We thought we would start with a program that has gotten a lot of coverage in the news, which is the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, which is pronounced or shortened CEWS or CEWS, depending on who you are. So we're going to use CEWS, and I'm going to turn over the CEWS section to Ted Thiessen over in Calgary. Ted, over to you.
Sure, thanks, Nina. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today. So I'll be talking about the emergency wage subsidy. So we call that CEWS or CEWS to pronounce the acronym, either way, whatever way you prefer. Basically introduced by Finance on Saturday, April 11th. Minister Morneau gave a press conference where he kind of outlined broad strokes of what that program was going to encompass, and then on that weekend, Canada passed the legislation. So it's known as the COVID-19 Emergency Response Act number 2. It was the second one because a temporary wage subsidy had been passed prior to that. The bill number, in case anyone's looking for it, is Bill C-14. The purpose, stated purpose for the subsidy, which is expected to cost Canada approximately $73 billion, was threefold: to support the well-being of employees, obviously, because the government was recognizing that a bunch of people were out of work temporarily or some permanently. It was also to enable employers to try to maintain employment relationships in a situation when cash flow was restricted or in some cases eliminated entirely. And then the third kind of purpose behind implementing the program in the way it was done was to kind of reduce stress on the regular EI insurance regime, which was getting inundated with claims, and they were having a hard time keeping up. So the CEWS is kind of a blunt instrument, sort of meant to take the pressure off some of that. Can I get the next slide, Nina? Thanks. Okay, so who's eligible for the CEWS? So you need to be a certain type of employer, first of all, to be eligible. We've listed the types of employers there. A corporation that's not a public institution. So basically, municipalities, universities, schools, hospitals, if you get some sort of federal kind of public funding, you're generally not going to qualify. And tax exempts also generally won't qualify, subject to a point we'll talk about in a second. individual employers, so sole proprietors who have their own employees could also qualify for this. And the reason we use the word individual there is because trusts for tax purposes are also individuals. So if you happen to have a trust that houses a bunch of employees in it, they could also qualify for this. Registered charities that are not public institutions would typically be expected to qualify as well. Registered charities are a tax recognized entity, so they would qualify, generally speaking. Certain tax exempt entities, aside from the broad carve out for tax exempts, certain types will qualify. So agricultural tax exempts are granted tax exempt status under a very specific section in the Act, so they would typically qualify. Boards of trade or chambers of commerce are two other examples of the types of tax exempt entities that would qualify, notwithstanding the broad tax exempt exclusion. If you happen to house a bunch of employees in a partnership, but all of the partners in the partnership are entities that would qualify under one of the other headings, then the partnership itself would also typically be expected to qualify for this subsidy. And there's also, they built in some flexibility into the legislation to be able to prescribe certain entities to qualify if they don't qualify under any of the other headings, but none of those have been prescribed so far. The one thing we wanted to make everybody aware of is that you need to have had a Canadian business number with a payroll account on March 15th, 2020 in order to qualify for the subsidy. So this was kind of aimed at preventing people who might have figured out a way to take advantage of it from quickly starting up some sort of a business and paying potentially wages that were only semi-legitimate. So this is kind of a broad instrument to eliminate that kind of quote unquote foul play. And I think the general thinking was that people who legitimately might be excluded under this heading is probably going to be a pretty small group. So that covers eligible employers. As far as eligible employees, what are we talking about here? So we're basically talking about employees that you would have issued a T4 to, so a real employee. So you won't catch independent contractors or quasi-employees under this program. So to the extent you're paying money to independent contractors or quasi-employees who aren't actual T4 employees, though that pay won't qualify for the subsidy. The employees that will qualify have to be working in Canada. So if you've got employees working, for example, in the US, pay to them wouldn't qualify for the subsidy. And generally speaking, an employee has to be without remuneration for, if an employee is without remuneration for 14 or more consecutive days in one of the qualifying periods, which we'll describe a little bit later, they wouldn't qualify because they would be expected to qualify for the CERB, which is the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit that Nina's going to talk about a little bit later. The one caveat to this is the legislation was clarified later so that people are now allowed to make like $1,000 or something like that. There's some sort of de minimis exemption. I think that covers that one, Nina. We can go to the next one. Okay. So which employees are covered provided they work in Canada and are actual employees? So it will cover both arm's length and non-arm's length employees. So you can get covered for pay that you're giving to directors or controlling shareholders, which wasn't always clear when they were kind of talking about it in broad strokes before they put the legislation in, but has become more clear now that the legislation has been out. So that's encouraging. Employers can put employees back on payroll retroactively to claim this use. For example, if following the passage of the legislation, you decided to hire a bunch of employees retroactively and paid them for weeks for which they had been laid off initially, but you were effectively giving them back pay, that back pay can, in most circumstances, also qualify for the subsidy. And if you end up, but because of the retroactive nature of the subsidy, if you end up, you could potentially end up in a situation where you laid off an employee, they started collecting the emergency response benefit or the CERB, and then you decide later to rehire them and give them back pay. So then they kind of would have got the benefit of both programs, which isn't really the intention. So in that scenario, the employee would likely be required to repay all or part of the CERB benefit, probably when they file their tax return or next year for 2020. Okay, eligible periods is one of the key concepts in the legislation because for a couple of reasons. One, you have to figure out in respect to what period you're paying your employees, and two, the kind of gating issue is that you have to have displayed or suffered a drop in revenue over a certain eligible period. So the eligible periods are outlined in this table for your reference. There are 3 so far. The legislation has flexibility for the government to add some later if that need should arise. So the first period, which is already over, but applications don't have to be filed for until, I think you have until October to file them. So these are just for reference. The first period was March 15th to April 11th. And then you had a second period of April 12th to May 9th, and the third period covered May 10th to June 6th. For each of those, what we're calling claiming periods, or what some people refer to as eligible periods, each of those relates to a specific reference period. So period 1, you can see the claiming period is March 15th to April 11th. So the reference period for that is March 2020. And the reference period in this table is basically meant to, or that's the period over which you have to be able to demonstrate that you've suffered a sufficient reduction in revenues to qualify for the subsidy. So each of the claiming periods in that first column there need to be applied for separately. So just because you qualify for one doesn't necessarily mean you qualify for all 3. You need to be able to show a revenue drop basically in each of them, subject to some specific rules we'll talk about later. So for example, to qualify for the subsidy on pay that you pay to employees in period 1 or in respective period 1, you need to be able to show a 15% revenue drop when you measure March 2020 against March 2019. That's kind of how this table works. So you read it left to right in that manner. And then for the April and May claiming periods, you need to be able to show a 30% revenue drop for each of those periods over the comparator period. So, which is either going to be the same month from the year prior, or as we'll talk about in a minute, an average of January and February of 2020, if you decide to use that method instead. I think that covers that one, Nina. Okay, yeah, I can talk about this real quick. The employer has, this is the revenue drop requirement. So just a note, we've gotten a lot of questions on it. You don't need to have suffered the revenue drop as a result of COVID-19. The instrument is more blunt than that. All you need to be able to do is show that your revenue is decreased by the required percentage. The other point is that when measuring the drop, it's gross revenues that matter, and it's not profit or taxable income. So and as I mentioned briefly, there's 2 ways to measure the drop. So for the March period, you would either take your revenue for March, you would compare it to March of 2019, or to an average of January and February in 2020. If you qualify under either of those, i.e., if your revenue has dropped by 15% or more when compared to either one of those reference periods, then you qualify for the subsidy for the March period. But with the caveat that once you choose to use either the same month from the year prior or the January-February average, you have to use that same method for purposes of calculating your eligibility for any future periods, like for April or May. But basically, so this would cover people, for example, businesses who started up through the middle of last year. So they didn't have a comparative period. They don't have month over month. They don't have a March 2019 period for which to measure against March of 2020. So they can use their January, February average from 2020 to come up with their benchmark.
Thank you, Ted. I think we're going to turn it over to Colin to take on the revenue drop and other ways of calculating it. So if I could take Colin to the next slide.
Great. Thank you, Nina. Thanks, Ted. So as we're dealing with here, how do you prove the revenue drop? Ted has ably set out the requirement, ambit, and purpose of the program. And the question we need to look at now is how do we deal with the computation of revenue? And revenue, as we discussed, is from a business carried on in Canada, whether foreign owned or not. Here we're presuming they have a business number, they're properly filing their taxes, they're on the CRA grid. and that income is derived from arm's length sources. It does, however, exclude a few considerations. One, it excludes extraordinary items. Two, it excludes amounts deemed to be received under the 10% subsidy. So that's dealt with separately, as we'll discuss in a later example. And three, it deals with special rules for entities who derive all or substantially all of their revenue from non-arm's length entities. And again, we'll look at the non-arm's length component, but those are the things we need to be being aware of to put them aside. And here, one important thing to look at is really the flexibility of this program. I think it's something that caught a lot of observers by surprise. Certainly we weren't, at least I was not expecting to see the breadth from the program. Not only are you able to use your 2019 comparison March to 2020 March, you can also, as Ted indicated, use the average of Jan-Feb 2020, but then there's further flexibility provided for in respect of whether or not you use accrual, so the standard accounting rules, or regular cash accounting rules for revenue recognition. Slide, please. So what about related entities? And here we see additional flexibility, which is the theme of the program. If you have normally consolidated financials, every member of the group is able to determine its qualifying revenue separately, provided that they adopt the same approach in so doing. So alternatively, you can choose to determine the number of revenue, the revenue figure on a consolidated basis on behalf of every member of the group. I'd highlight here that this provides tactical flexibility. What we would suggest to clients in these instances is you will want to have a plan, and that plan will want to be involving what is your exposure, what's your optionality in terms of your employees across the various structures that you have them. How do we look at that revenue to make sure that you can assist as many employees as possible? And so in some instances, you might be able to include revenues on a consolidated basis if you're looking at a consolidated approach that would otherwise not be able to access this programming entirely appropriately because of the scope of the losses from some of the loss codes. Again, as Ted has noted, special rules exist for joint ventures and partnerships. Equally, there are special rules for entities that derive all or substantially all the revenue from non-arm's length sources. Slide. So, in terms of looking at the alternative method on a simplified basis, as we discussed, it's important to understand your base choices, your comparators. So you can average your income for January and Feb 2020 to establish a monthly income basis. Against this, you'll want to compare the established income average that you have for the month of comparison purpose. So you compare that average established by Jan 2020 to the results in March, April, and May. As indicated, if the program is extended, then the comparison examples would presumably continue to apply. But for now, March, April, and May, and noting, of course, that March is at a lower figure of 15%. Cash accrual or regular accounting method exists as well, but once you pick a method, and this is really the key component, you must maintain that method consistently. We would also note that if you qualify for a monthly period, you automatically qualify for the subsequent period. And this is to provide businesses with a measure of flexibility in planning. Slide, please. In terms of revenue reduction and difficulty, it's important to acknowledge the timing components that exist as well. And here it's important to note that there's a gap between the application and the actual period for which the remuneration would apply and the timing upon which you will absolutely receive the funds from the government. And so at the time the remuneration is paid, you may not know whether or not you're qualifying for CEWS. And the example we look at here is whether or not we're dealing with bi-weekly pay periods, wages paid on April 24th in respect of the 2 prior weeks, or only the second of those weeks. Again, pay in respect of April 3rd to 19 would only qualify if the gross revenues from April 2020 exceeded 70% of the gross revenues from April 2019, or the gross revenues from April 2020 exceeded 70% of the Jan-Feb 2020 average. We await further clarification for charities and NFPs, but note the broad application ambit of these programs. Slide, please. So there's been no clarity as of yet as to what happens if an employer uses a third-party professional employer organization as labor supplier. As always, this brings us to the question as to whose employees that these actually properly pertain to. What we have been advising clients is that they need to be involved in early communication with their counsel to ensure that they have a plan and the proper documentation in place to substantiate any filing positions that are taken. Again, this may depend upon how we treat the expenses in the financial statements and the other components of the financials as they're assembled together. There is no relief for pre-revenue entities, for example, startups, and we've seen a question into the question that had raised this point, and we await further clarification from CRA and finance on these points. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Colin. And I think what we thought we would do is just have a little bit of fun with numbers. And I think we selected Ted Thiessen to start doing a little bit of an example of a Q's calculation. And Ted, if I could ask you to take over from here.
Basically, once you've got a qualifying employer and a qualifying employee, and you've met the kind of revenue reduction tests that you need to meet, the obvious question is what's the amount of the subsidy you're going to qualify for. So the first thing I'd note is that you basically, mechanically, the subsidy is calculated on a per employee basis. So when we're talking here, we're going to talk about how much money would you get back when you make a payment to a particular employee. So it's basically set up as the lesser kind of two amounts. So, or the greater two amounts, I should say. So the first amount is set out in part one of what we'll call the test. And part one of the test will give you a number, and you pick the least of the three. So 75% of the amount of what we call eligible remuneration actually paid in the week claimed. Okay, so that's 75% of what you actually pay to the employee in the week we're talking about. The second amount there is $847 per week. So, and because this is set up as a least of, $847 per week per employee is the max amount of the subsidy that you can get. And then this part of the test says the amount under part one is going to be nil if your employee is non-arm's length, i.e. a controlling shareholder or a family member of a controlling shareholder or director. Those are all typically going to be non-arm's length employees. So under part one of the test, their amount is going to be zero. Next slide, Nina. Thanks. So part two is going to give you, in some circumstances, a different number. And if part two is greater than part one, you actually get part two. So part two set up is the least of the actual amount of pay to the employee in the week. 75% of the employee is what we'll call pre-crisis weekly remuneration. So that's the average of their pay, their weekly pay over January, February, basically. And then the last number again is the $847 weekly max. So this, if what you've got is an employee who's a non-arm's length employee, i.e. a controlling shareholder or a director or a family member of such an individual, then you're only going to get an amount greater than zero under part two. So it's part two you're going to want to be looking at. Next slide, Nina. So in some circumstances, as a result of the way the formulae work, you can actually get covered for 100% of the remuneration that you're paying to an employee in an eligible period. But that's only going to happen if, first of all, they're under the $847 max, and if their pay has dropped from what they were getting paid prior to the COVID pandemic, i.e. prior to the crisis. The total maximum subsidy, you'll see that in the second bullet, is $10,164 per employee. That's the $847 maximum multiplied by 16. That's how we get that. It could go up if finance ends up extending the program past June 6th, but for right now, that's the maximum. And as we noted, regulation potentially could extend the program to September 30th, as it's currently worded, but hasn't been extended yet. Okay, now I'm ready. So in terms of hiring new employees, to the extent that those employees are arm's length, i.e. not controlling shareholders, not directors, not related to any of those people, you can go ahead and hire employees, new employees, and get covered, get a portion of that pay covered under the subsidy. Non-arm's length employees, you can't hire any new people, which basically means that you can't simply decide that you're now going to hire a bunch of family members and try to get a subsidy for a bunch of money that you're going to pay to them. That's kind of the blunt instrument they've used to kind of prevent that from happening. Now, the one situation where this has actually become a bit of a concern is that a lot of owner-managers, for example, take the bulk of their compensation from their company via dividends and not via salary. So in that circumstance, that individual wouldn't have quote unquote pre-crisis employment income. And so they're not, any salary that they suddenly get in an eligible period is not going to qualify for the subsidy because they were getting paid by a dividend before that. Whether or not there's a principled basis for drawing that distinction is a matter of some debate, but that is the distinction that's kind of the hard line that's been drawn in the legislation as it's currently worded. Okay. Okay, so we're going to go through a couple of examples here. There are actually several examples in the slides, but we don't really have time to go through them all, so I'll go through a couple of basic ones. So on this one, let's assume that you've got an employee who was making $962 a week prior to the pandemic, and you maintain that salary post-pandemic. So under the formula, that employee, that wages paid to that employee would qualify for a subsidy in an amount equal to the greater of either one or two. So the least, under one, it's the least of 962 times 75%, so $722, which is less than the $847 max. And this employee is assumed to be arm's length. So that part one of the test gives you $722. Under part two of the test, actual compensation is $962. Compensation paid, the baseline compensation or compensation paid pre-crisis is $962 times 75%, so that's $722, which gives you the same number you had in number one above. And again, the max is $847, which is greater than the $722. So in the kind of first example there, you get the same number either way. $722 of the $962 would be your subsidy number. If you reduced it on the bottom half of that slide, if you reduced it by 20% post-crisis so that you're only paying that employee $769, your numbers become different. So test under part one of the test, it's the least of what they're getting paid, $769 times 75%, so that's $577. That's still less than your weekly max. And again, this is an arm's length employee we're assuming here. So part one of the test spits out $577. Part two of the test actually gives you a higher number because you're actually paying $769. The pre-crisis pay was $962. 75% of that is $722. So that's the number you get, which is still less than the $847 max. So because the test lets you take the greater of one and two, you get covered for $722 of the $769 you're paying. So almost all of it, but not quite under that example. Okay, let's go to the bottom here. So we just wanted to show you one example where you could actually get compensated for the whole amount that you're paying to your employee post-crisis. And that's basically if you are in a situation where you are reducing that employee's pay by more than 25% when compared to what their pre-crisis pay was. So in the example at the bottom half of this slide, we're contemplating a 40% reduction in salary. So under part one of the test, it's the amount you're actually paying, so that's $461 now, times 75%, so that gives you $346. That's obviously way less than the max. And again, we're assuming arm's length, so C doesn't apply there. So part one of the test lets you get a subsidy for $346. Part two of the test lets you get the least of the amount you're actually paying, so that's $461. The amount of pre-crisis pay, which was $769, times 75%, so that's $576 here. And then $847. So you're always going to be capped at what you actually pay, which is $461. But because in this example, they've experienced a decrease of more than 25%, and you're actually paying less than the max, you're going to get covered for everything you pay to that employee for the week, $461.40. So obviously the exercise is pretty numbers intensive, and you got to crunch a bunch of numbers to try to figure out what scenario kind of works for both you and the employee that hopefully gets them enough money to kind of get through the next few months, and at the same time lets you get as much subsidy as you can get. That's kind of the exercise. Pretty numbers intensive and very employee specific. Next slide, Nina. Okay, so we've had a bunch of questions on this because in the initial press conferences where the government was announcing the package, they kind of said that employers were going to be expected to make best efforts to keep employees at what we call pre-crisis compensation, i.e. not to reduce their pay. And to the extent possible that the government was going to pay 75% of the wage, they kind of expected employers to cover the remaining 25%. None of that language has actually been included in the legislation. So while the government has said employers are expected to make good faith and best efforts to keep employees at the pay they were getting before, there's no penalty built into the legislation if that can't or doesn't happen. But there does appear to be a good faith expectation on the part of government that employers will do what they can to keep employees whole. And obviously there are employer employee considerations with respect to what they expect their employers to do. And there are constructive dismissal and breach of contract considerations associated with any pay reductions, obviously. One more note on an additional subsidy that was included in the CEWS package. To the extent that you are making employer contributions for CPP and EI premiums, those will also be refunded to you to the extent that they're made in respect of eligible remuneration. So that's kind of a measure to kind of another attempt to kind of increase cash flow for the employers. And for employers with employees in Quebec, it also applies to QPP and QPIP premiums, the employer half of those premiums.
Ted, I'm just going to skip you a few slides because I'm keeping an eye on time. So yeah. I just thought we'd go to the next steps for employers slide, and then move on to our example that we have. Okay?
Sure. So basically, what should you be doing to kind of get ready for this? The portal opened on Monday, but as I said, applications can be made until October. But you obviously want to be getting money as quickly as you can. So make sure you're registered for direct deposit with CRA. Kind of get all the records together that you need to get to be able to demonstrate the revenue reduction. CRA's got a wage subsidy calculator. It's a little bit rough, but it lets you get a pretty good idea of the numbers of the amount of subsidy that you'd qualify for. We've included a link there. And generally speaking, what we're hearing is that payments, to the extent that people were able to apply on Monday, those people are kind of expecting payments to start flowing end of next week by May 7th. That might be optimistic, but that's the information we've got so far.
Well, thank you, Ted. I'm going to turn this over to Colin to actually work through a small cash flow example just to see how this actually works for your business. Colin?
Great. Thanks, Nina. Thanks, Ted. So I will move through this relatively quickly in view of the fact that we've outlined this information already and we're pressed for time, so we can move right into the example. And here we're looking at 4 components. Lots of slides flashing. Okay, hopefully we're settling on to slide 33. Perfect. Excellent. We have measurement is key, and we see that there's 4 components to this: method, adjustments, consolidate, comparable periods. And these are the 4 components that we'll want to bear in mind as we look to the example to try and find the right outcome for everyone. 34, please. So in terms of our example, the question is how to account for revenue. And as a starting point, we've already discussed that there's 2 flexible options that we would consider: the accrual method, in terms of the standard approach, including sales on account of AR, WIP, and cash method based on actual sales cash receipts. Slide, please. In terms of dealing with adjustments, we adjust for items not in the course of ordinary activities, extraordinary items, revenue from non-arm's length parties, and related subsidies received or receivable. And just as a side note here, it may be worth having a discussion with counsel and your accountant if there's matters that you're not entirely sure how should be accounted for, bearing in mind that accountants don't have privilege. So if you send an email to them on this topic, you'll want to make sure that you thought that email through. Slide, please. So consolidation. Flexible options here in terms of whether or not you consolidate the financial results of the affiliated group, joint venture, partnership. There's few restrictions in terms of how you do it, but the general rule of thumb is be consistent. Limited restrictions to consolidate. Previous consolidated financials are not required, and there's no requirement for same for the similar type of business. Slide, please. So the question of what period, and as we've discussed here, we can look at dealing with the calendar month of 2019, month-to-month comparisons, or the average of January-Feb 2020. This provides some assistance for cyclical businesses, startups, R&D, and there's a same basis comparison for all qualifying periods. Slide. So let's look at an example very quickly. And here we're assuming a related group of corporations, all Canadian, private Canadian controlled private corporations. It's an associated group. And let's apply some COVID-19 facts. We have operating results in Phase 1 March. Different entities within the corporate group are hit hard, but to varying extents. And we have salaries ranging between $15,000 and $1.6 million. Obviously, we'd want to opt into the higher range side, but the point is there's a range in terms of the salary components. All in, 135 salaries, salaried employees, salary average of $60,000. Slide, please. And here what we look at when we look at our example, and my apologies, I don't have the pointer and the bow tie to go full tax nerd on people, but when we have this, what we'd be looking at is we'd see the OPCO A would be showing $1 in terms of its January, February 2020, and then things started to go badly in March 2020 with 0.5 in terms of, on the far side, its outcome. We look at OPCO B, we see that it had skinnier income of 0.3 in Jan-Feb 2020, and that it wasn't impacted at all when we look at March 2020. And here I recognize I'm ignoring, just for the current moment, that middle column, but the point is that OPCO B was not impacted. Similarly, passive corporation wasn't impacted at all. And so the goal is not only to try and get OPCO A involved with the employees that may be embedded therein, but to see whether or not it's possible to get those additional entities, those additional corporations, the employees included in our CEWS application. And what we would do is we would look and we would say the January-February average works out for us, but the March 2019 does not. And the conclusion again is that consolidation permits us to include OPCO B along with the passive corporation. And so this is a very, very rough and ready example to try and outline the process that we want to take. It's not a question of getting just one corporation or the other. It's stepping back and asking, what's the highest level example output that we can get to? Perfect. Nina, am I turning this over to you?
So thank you very much, Colin and Ted. Just wanted to very quickly indicate that although we've spent a lot of time on CEWS, there are other governmental measures aimed at helping employees. And so we need to sort of think about how all of these interact with CEWS, or maybe your company does not actually qualify for CEWS, and so you're looking at some of the other programs. So there's a 10% temporary wage subsidy for small businesses, work-sharing programs under EI, supplementary unemployment insurance benefits, and the CERB, Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, which is actually given directly to employees and independent contractors who have suffered income loss. Now, the 10% temporary wage subsidy was announced first. It was for Canadian-controlled private corporations, not-for-profits, registered charities, and individual business proprietors that had a threshold of 15 million taxable capital or partnerships of same. Now, this is an important point for you to know, that it's automatically assumed that you're going to apply for it if you're eligible, and it's paid for really by way of an offset or deduction on remittances that you would otherwise be liable to pay the government. But in terms of CEWS or CEWS, it's really important to keep a track on that temporary wage subsidy, because if you're entitled to it, it's assumed that you're going to take it, and it reduces the actual dollar value of the CEWS payment that you will receive. Now, work sharing. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this is an employment insurance concept whereby effectively there is a partial reduction in hours, or a partial layoff, if you want to call it that. And EI will essentially pay prorated EI benefits to your employees for the portion of time that they're unemployed. And you will pay them for the hours that they work as an employer. Now, it's been greatly simplified. When I was a young pup, it used to take 30 days or more. It required a formal proof of downturn, and it required a formal recovery plan. None of that applies anymore. And while it does require approval, we're hearing stories of people applying and getting contacted by an officer within 24 to 48 hours, although the government has committed a 10-day turnaround period. Now, one thing that you need to know is that there's some misleading information on the government website. It is not intended to be a criticism. It's a recognition that things are moving so fast that sometimes websites haven't been updated, but the application form is where you should go, and it's greatly simplified, and it actually walks you through the process. A couple of things you need to think about. is any amounts that are paid by EI to your employees will actually reduce any CEWS payment that your company or business might be otherwise entitled to. So in general, if you think you're going to be entitled to the CEWS payment, perhaps work sharing is not the best way to go. The other thing you need to know is that, like all EI payments, it's subject to clawback at tax time if your employee earns more than $67,750 in 2020 from all employment sources. So typically for higher wage businesses, work sharing is less attractive. So I'm encouraging people to talk to their accountants and rerun the numbers and see whether or not work sharing works. There were a tremendous number of applications made in middle of March. If it may be worth thinking about whether you want to cancel those in light of the greater availability of the CEWS payment. One other thing, and I won't go through EI in detail because that's really an employee benefit. One thing you need to know is even if your employee is laid off and terminated and would ordinarily get EI, they're all going to be paid CERB first. And that's just the way it is, even if they ordinarily would have earned more under EI. And so there is the, if, as mentioned earlier, I think by Ted, you cannot get a CEWS payment for an employee who haven't paid in 14 days consecutive in the qualifying period. CERB has been changed a little bit. Employees can earn up to $1,000 or in a 4-week period. Income includes employment and self-employment. And CERB does not apply to employees who are taking parental compassionate care leave or the other kinds of EI leave. They will go into the regular EI period. Another word on CERB is, I'll get a lot of questions on this. There is a program called Supplementary Unemployment Benefits. It's a way, quite frankly, of employers being able to top up employees who are on EI. There is no indication yet whether or not we can top up CERB payments the way some employers topped up EI payments. However, remember, you can pay your employees up to $1,000 in a 4-week period without impacting their eligibility. One thing that's also interesting about CERB payments is there's no indication of clawback. You remember I mentioned a clawback at tax time if an employee earns more than $67,750. That has not been talked about, and I didn't see that in the legislation. So CERB has some interesting differences from EI. It's a simpler version, if you will, of EI. And so this was mentioned, I think, by Ted earlier. It's possible to retroactively put people back on payroll to take advantage of the CEWS program. And what will happen is there will be a repayment obligation on your employee at tax time or perhaps before, but certainly by tax time, April 2021. And I also mentioned the supplementary unemployment insurance benefits, which is a top-up mechanism. Now, remember, if you're going to try to top up anything and it's regular EI as opposed to parental, pregnancy, or illness and disability, you must have an application, and there's the application link. I've given it to you. And the application is essentially got to be approved, but the approval will be retroactively dated to the date of your application. So those are some of the programs that are employee focused that help either employees or employers help their employees, and we're all trying to get through this together. Whirlwind review of some of the other programs. One is the Canada Emergency Business Account, or CEBA or KEBA, and that is actually administered through your own financial institution. It's not an application to the government. It's an interest-free loan of up to $40,000 for small businesses, and that's defined as the size of your payroll in 2019, 20 million to 1.5 million in 2019. Business can't be owned by somebody holding political office, can't promote violence, your business can't promote violence, hatred, or discriminate on the basis of sex, gender, or other protected grounds. And you have to use it to pay non-deferrable operating costs, and can't use it to increase dividends, management compensation, or prepay or refinance debt. The nice thing about the CEBA loan is that if it gets paid on or before December 31st, 2022, essentially there will be a loan forgiveness of 25%. So not only is it interest-free, it's essentially getting $40,000 at the cost of $30,000 if you recover sufficiently to pay it off. There's some business credit or liquidity programs through EDC and BDC that you have to apply through EDC and BDC for. And in the interest of time, we will not go through details. And there is the very well announced Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance. And that essentially is a program whereby landlords who have a mortgage will be given a forgivable loan. So this is, you have to remember, it's the landlord that gets the forgivable loan, as long as they lower the rent by 75% for their small business tenants. And a small business tenant is one who pays less than 50% per month, 50,000 per month in rent. It's still a pretty hefty amount, but 50,000 per month in rent. And it's a conjunctive test, they've either stopped operating, so think about your restaurants or storefront operations, or have experienced a 70% drop in pre-COVID-19 revenue. So a much, much higher threshold than what you saw in the CEWS program. And nonprofits and charitable organizations may also receive this benefit, but we're looking for some clarification from finance as to what their criteria will be. So that's the Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance, and many of my clients will be trying to get some assistance through that program. And the expectation, effectively, if you look at how the numbers work, is the government takes care of a 50%, so that's a forgivable loan to the landlord. The tenant pays 25%, and essentially the landlord absorbs 25%. And just, I will have this at the end, but we've done a detailed seminar on the Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance, and at the end of this program, I've given you a link to that. And there's also some deferrals, of taxes. The income tax filing deadline is extended to June 1st for individuals, and the payment deadline to September 1st, and also some deferrals of GST, HSTs, custom tariffs, and some municipalities have also deferred property tax. And all of this is really to help your cash flow. Eventually you're going to have to pay it, but it does help with present cash flow issues, and cash is king. Now, most of you who are on this call, it's hard for us because we can't see you, are in the biotech industry and have been watching a number of announcements made by Prime Minister Trudeau over the last 2 weeks with great interest. So we're not going to go through all of these in any detail at all, but just have put in slides so you have an inventory of the various initiatives announced by the federal government, including on coronavirus research and medical countermeasures. We also have the Strategic Innovation Fund for COVID-19 with a very specific email site. If you believe that you have a vaccine or can assist with clinical trials, this is the email site for you to essentially register your interest in participating in the Strategic Innovation Fund for COVID-19. And also for those of you who believe you can assist in expanding biomanufacturing capacity, vaccine manufacturing, medication manufacturing, this is the site that you should be registered at. For all I know, most of you have already gone ahead and, if you qualify, and done that. But again, this is intended to be an inventory of what's been announced in the last few weeks. And then there's a number of supports that have been announced to protect Canadian jobs, about which we don't have sufficient details right now to help you. Perhaps we'll be invited again. One of the things that we mentioned earlier is that it's very difficult for startups, and there is actually a $20 million fund for futurepreneurs, for young entrepreneurs who are starting up. So it's just trying to help the startup young community. A lot of these measures, as you will see, are really for innovative early stage companies that aren't really able to access other measures that are available. And then this is a procurement plan that many of you are already aware of, so I'm just going to skip through this very quickly in the interest of time, all of which focusing our energies on responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention and do a specific shout out to Indigenous owned businesses. There's a specific fund of $306.8 million to help small and medium-sized Indigenous businesses. And that is regardless of whether it's in the biotech sphere or any other sphere. But some of you may actually qualify for the Indigenous business funding. And so I wanted to include it in this seminar. So I don't even want to think about what the total bill is going to be, but most economists say that we've got to keep liquidity in the economy or we're going to go into another recession. One other thing I wanted to do as a shout out is measures to help youth and students. I'm the parent of an 18-year-old, so it's a very, very dear to my heart. Essentially, if you had funding through the Canada Summer Job Programs, now that funding portal or opportunity is closed, you should know that there is a potential increase of 100% of the minimum hourly wage for each employee, and an ability to extend employment to February 28, 2021. So it's not really a summer jobs program. The government is recognizing that many opportunities have been curtailed due to COVID-19, and so people will be seeking to perhaps start even as late as September or July, and the funding will carry on to February 28, 2021. And it also allows for part-time hires, which wasn't allowed before. There's a number of programs that I encourage you to look at. I'm going to talk about a couple of them to really help you develop additional job placements. There's a student work placement program I'm going to talk about. I'm actually on the board of BioTalent Canada, so we administer that. MyTax is additional funding for job placements. And there's a number of business and higher education initiatives to create 5,000 to 10,000 new student placements. So really a recognition that people who are just starting their careers are going to be very much impacted by what's happening in the marketplace right now. MyTax, as I mentioned before, has significant funding for interns, and I've included the link to see where you can explore whether you might be eligible. And it's a hefty subsidy. So really the company covers $3,750, and MyTax subsidy could actually cover the balance up to $15,000. Biotalent.ca has significant funding for CoOp student salaries, so it's $50,000 to maximum of $5K, and 70% to a maximum of $7,000 for first-year students because they're young, underrepresented groups such as women, Indigenous peoples, people with disabilities, and newcomers or immigrants. So I've given you those two links, which has very helpful information. And I'm going to skip through the actual requirements, although they are here. As you can tell, there's a plethora of information, and it's sometimes hard to find out where the information is. Our favorite site is the Canada government website, which is routinely updated, and that's the link. Our own Gowling WLG website, I mentioned we had a seminar earlier this week on the commercial rent assistance program, and that's the webinar there. We invite you to subscribe on COVID-19 topics, and because of legislation, you do have to subscribe to get those updates. And we want to thank you very much, all of us, for having paid attention through what has been a very intense and whirlwind tour through our program. I'm going to leave that up so that I hope that was helpful to all of you. And of course, what I know there's been a number of questions. What we plan to do, Ted, Colin, and I, is go through your questions using the Q&A function and issue an FAQ along with the webinar update so you have answers to your questions. Emily, I hope that's helpful to you.
Yes, that's hugely helpful. We will do that since we are just about out of time. Nina, Colin, and Ted, thank you all so much for taking the time to be here with us today and going through this really important topic that has been well attended today. And yeah, really grateful for your time.
Thank you, our pleasure.
Thanks.
And I know your colleague Jennifer Tam, she did add some links to the chat feature to all attendees. So if anyone's curious for more information, you can go ahead and click that link down at the bottom in the chat feature. So with that, if we are taking questions after the session and sending out the FAQ page to all attendees, we will end it there. Thanks again.
Emily, I have one thing. I believe there is a seminar that Gowling's is doing with Biotech Canada next week. Did you want to give a shout out for that as well?
Yes, I do, but the time and date has not yet been confirmed. So I will wait to do that by email. Great.
Well, thank you for inviting us very much.
Of course, thanks for
We
being
really
here.
enjoyed it.
Great. All right. Well, thanks everyone. I will end the meeting right here.
Thank you.